Hi, I'm Mike Reynolds, a senior reporter covering the media industry with S&P Global Market Intelligence, Tech, Media, and Telecom News Team. Welcome to MediaTalk, a podcast hosted by S&P Global, where the news and research staff explore issues in the ever-evolving media landscape. Today, I'm joined by my colleague Iuri Struta over in London, and we're going to be talking about one of the hottest, if not the hottest sector in the tech world, generative artificial intelligence. AI is becoming more integral to every facet of our professional and personal lives, and the investment dollars are following suit. Iuri has recently written about the financial push behind GenAI. Moreover, MediaTalk is coming to Iuri just a day after he's part of July 15th webinar entitled H1, Review of the GenAI Funding. Can the market keep up with record volumes? Iuri, you've been busy. Are you tired? How are you feeling today?
Hey, Mike, I'm feeling great. Thanks for having me.
Can you give us a sense of what GenAI is and what are some of the areas, business sectors it is impacting? Or maybe a better question, where isn't it impacting the world?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. What area of or what businesses doesn't GenAI impact today? It definitely looks something like similar to the internet in the 2000 with we had the massive build-outs. Back then it was fiber. Now it's data centers. The big question on everyone's mind is whether we're going to overbuild like we did in fiber and many other technological advancements. So my money is on that we will be overbuilding because history says so, and it's always easier to overbuild. But you talk about the GenAI impact. I think it is indeed pretty wide. So a lot of companies are rushing to implement GenAI tools within their own organizations, but the success so far has been mixed. Organizations, they have different levels of preparation. The more digitally mature companies are better prepared to adopt GenAI than those that aren't, for example. So if you look at some 451 research, as a company owned by S&P Global Market Intelligence, they're seeing an increase in project abandonment rates this year compared to last year. The question that I have is, are we heading into a trough of disillusionment? Maybe we are, and at least the surveys show that it's not all great and awesome with GenAI adoption.
But that being said, I guess too, as this becomes more prevalent, experimentation, there's going to be success and failure. So that's part and parcel, I would think, of the rapid adoption.
Yeah, I think the more you experiment, the more failures you have, then the more the possibility that eventually you're going to get to a successful project. But I'm afraid here some companies see their projects are not delivering what they're expected or what they expect. Then they could abandon the projects altogether and they become disillusioned and they're not trying, or at least they're waiting for a while for the technology to become more mature before trying again. This could be like a part of the cycle. This is a part of the cycle. You have the hype.
Right.
Everyone is excited and have a little bit of disillusionment. Technology is not as good as we thought it is. And then you have more realistic expectations or normal expectation. If I could talk about myself, when I first saw ChatGPT, I thought everything is over, basically. This is so smart and you have lots of stuff. I was thinking about whether my job is going to become obsolete in 2 months. This is what I was thinking. In the end, you look into it and then you see that the hype maybe a little bit went into overdrive and then it dies down a little bit and expectations become more realistic. And then you're learning how to work with it.
Sure, that makes sense. As this goes, though, again, whatever stage of the cycle we're in at the moment, where we are today, at least in the first half of the year, there was incredible investment levels. Can you talk about how big the market became that way?
Yes. So we recorded about 78 billion invested by VCs and corporates in GenAI companies, this is already higher than last year.
The full year, right? So the half is better than the full year.
Exactly, yeah. So about already 50%, maybe a little bit less than that. It's already higher. So I wouldn't be surprised if we end the year at about 150 billion or more.
Oh, really?
We're sure to cross the 100 billion mark this year, which will be double the last year's numbers. And to give you some perspective, I think funding for GenAI companies quintupled in 2023 from a relatively low level. It doubled in 2024. and is on track to double again in 2025. So we're doubling every year now. We'll see what's happening in 26.
A couple of big transactions, though, pushed this along, right?
Yeah, a lot of funding was for just a few transactions in what we call the application layer. For example, OpenAI is $40 billion round. And then the sort of the infrastructure, or in this case, the software tooling layer with Scale AI, essentially selling a large stake in the company to Meta AI. And this was what has driven the numbers so high. And this was the driver in previous years as well, mostly from foundation model companies.
Those two big transactions notwithstanding, there's still a lot of other money was being invested, which I guess speaks to interest, and you're expecting a lot more to come in the second half, right?
Yeah, I expect at least a similar amount of funding.
Okay.
We already know some of the funding rounds that happened in Q3, they did not make it into the first half numbers. So we have rumors that Anthropic is going to get another massive round. XAI with Elon Musk company raised 10 billion in equity and debt. So that's going to make it already into the second half of the year. Year to date, we're already, I think, probably just around $100 billion. So like closing in.
Okay. I think you mentioned the foundational model sector. Can you give us a little sense for what that is? And a lot of interest there, I take it.
So the foundational model players, they are not that many.
Okay.
So you could say they have the magnificent seven, let's say, or the founding seven. Meta has a foundation model, Alphabet, OpenAI, Anthropic, XAI, Mistral, and we could throw into that DeepSeek. So these are the main frontier foundation models, and mainly this is where a lot of the funding goes.
These companies, again, in this sense, they're owning their own models, right? Is that what we're looking at? And I guess that's certainly an important consideration.
Yes. So they are owning their foundation models and they are having their own applications, but they're also selling or allowing others to use their foundation models and build on top of the foundation models. So it depends here what you have. You can have open source or closed source, but essentially they have their own applications and they allow those foundation models to be used by other companies in the application layer, so to speak.
You mentioned the application layer. There's a lot of activity there as well, right?
Yeah, so I think we did an exercise, we excluded foundation models because the numbers are big there and you have a few outsized deals and it doesn't give a good picture of what's happening in the application layer. So we've noted quite a few companies in the application layer that they don't own a frontier foundation model, but they have strong business model. They're not as capital intensive as the ones that race for the best models. And in many cases, what they do, they fine tune existing models to suit their needs or train their own smaller models for a specific use case. And if you look at companies like Synthesia in video generation, Synthesia, they do have their own foundation model, but it's for a niche in video, for example. You have Perplexity in search, you have Cursor AI and Windsurf in coding. This is where the money goes in the application layer. A lot of these companies have built strong businesses that are already generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenues. And in certain cases, there is a battle between the larger companies for this company, like we saw with Windsurf.
Let's talk a little bit about yesterday's webinar, a first half review of GenAI funding. Can the market keep up with record volumes? It was a virtual event. Sarah James, who leads the TMT news team within S&P Global Market Intelligence and who is the editor of MediaTalk, was the moderator. Iuri, who are you also joined by?
Yeah, it was a great webinar and one of the best I've done so far at S&P, if not the best. And we talked about the latest developments, GenAI funding, which we already touched on, and also how organizations are implementing AI, whether the funding market is in a bubble. We touched on AI policy, how different jurisdictions are approaching AI, the competition between them, and lots of other stuff. As you mentioned, Sarah James, our colleague, was on the call, and we had our AI analyst at 451, Alex Johnston, And then we had Alexandru Voica from Synthesia. This is the head of policy and communications at Synthesia, which is, as I've said, one of the leading GenAI startups in Europe.
I listened to the webinar yesterday, and there's a lot of good back and forth among you three guys, and I think a big turnout, right? Can you give us any sense for what the audience, what their interests were in? Was it broad-based, or did they focus in on a couple of areas?
So, for example, I gave a summary of what we're seeing in the market, and I spent some time in showing what we understand to be an AI company. This question has caused a lot of confusion, and I used my best to explain what a GenAI company is, because if you look generally, AI is also a tech stack. We are looking at the companies that sort of participate in the value chain, that develop this AI stack, and then they sell it as a product. And I look at companies like the foundation model providers, of course, companies like Synthesia. They're creating video avatars for corporate communications use cases, for example. And other companies use that technology to improve or AI enable their businesses. So yeah, it is to understand the difference between companies that use AI and companies that create AI or participate in the creation of the AI stack. And it starts with semiconductors and ends up with the application layer.
You mentioned chips, NVIDIA, Neo Clouds, which is something we spoke about during our April installment of MediaTalk. So yeah, the conversation, and again, I guess the integration of all of these elements, it's complex, and that's why it's so fascinating at this juncture. One thing that you mentioned, text, Iuri, and a lot of companies are using AI to produce video. And I thought it was one of the interesting points during the webinar was the carbon emissions. Again, if you're doing traditional filming, obviously there's a lot of people on set, there's transportation, there's other things. And so I guess the reduction there with AI is very helpful. Conversely, I was surprised that you said text is the same. So that was an interesting part. Another part of the discussion I thought was interesting, Alexandru, he talked about the geography of where the U.S. stands versus Europe versus the Middle East versus China in terms of where the regulation policies are and how that's influencing the use of AI in various capacities. I thought that was a very interesting point.
Yeah, I think with Alexandru and Synthesia, he's very close to what happens in Europe and especially in AI policy. He emphasized that in Europe, they need to focus on, from a business perspective, a sustainable company from the get-go, rather than relying on massive infusions of capital from venture capitalists, which could be the case in the US. If you are in the US, you can run companies for many years, big losses, because there's always going to be easier for you to raise additional capital. In Europe, you need to show that you have a sustainable business model and you're focusing to become profitable really quickly. So this is like, you talked about the difference between being a US company and a European-based company. And another thing that he spoke about, the policy in Europe and how it has been a big struggle for AI startups to deal with the different AI policies, that sometimes they may be vague, hard to understand, they can be conflicting. In some cases, they even defeat their own purposes. And Alexandru and Synthesia, they're very active in trying to shape AI policy here in the UK and Europe, and they're often providing what you'd say constructive criticism to the lawmakers in Europe.
Now, we just touched on a couple of points of the webinar. Iuri, what did you learn from the conversation, a point that resonated with you?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest and most interesting thing that I learned was actually to see what our participants think about whether we are in a GenAI funding bubble or not. So this was a survey question that we asked everyone, and whether their thoughts. So basically, I think the majority thought that valuations in GenAI funding are very high, but they expect a lot of these companies to grow into their high valuations. So they're thinking that at this point, the valuations, given the tremendous growth in revenue that many of these companies experienced, the valuations are justified. So yeah, this was my big takeaway, especially with the engagement of the audience.
Okay. For those who might have missed it, you can access a replay by going to the webinar replay portal under the events tab at spglobal.com/market-intelligence. It's worth your while. There's a lot of good stuff there and about 55 minutes of content. So it's worth checking out. As we get into the end here, Iuri, again, you've talked about the investment levels here already at a record pace, first half beating 2024 in its entirety, a lot more to come in the second half and beyond. And again, just as an example, right out of the gate, we saw that XAI secured a big amount of money early on just to get us started early in July, right?
Yes. So yeah, we have XAI, but yeah, we're probably going to continue to have these headlines coming with investments being made in a lot of these GenAI companies for the second half, and then probably into 2026 as well. We don't see this ending. And one interesting thing, and why I believe that, is that what we noticed is the competition between a lot of these foundation model providers is actually intensifying the competition to obtain chips and build the largest data center possible. And competition for talent is also intensifying.
Right.
There is no slowdown there. And if you look at companies like Alphabet and Meta that have their own foundation model and they compete, they have their regular businesses that are producing tons of cash and they can finance it. But if you look at those private companies, Anthropic, OpenAI, Mistral, they don't have that cash cow. And what they need to do is they need to access capital from the outside, or say, we're done with this, we're selling to someone else, or we're just getting out of the game altogether. So we don't see yet a lot of these companies wanting to get out of the game or to consolidate. Inflection AI is another pretender to be a frontier foundation models, and they threw in the towel in 2024. And we thought that this might be the start of it. But since then, nobody big threw in the towel. They actually doubled down. And
Right.
doubling down with, look at OpenAI, XAI, and Mistral. They're building their own compute now, huge clusters. So, seeing all that, you have 7 foundation model providers. They're not giving up. And I don't know, history suggests that you probably in the end going to have like maybe 3, max 4 winners. And we're still far away from that.
So a lot of dynamics in play, a lot of what's going to be where we might be a few years from now. There's still going to be a lot of intrigue and a lot of developments. And I know you're going to be keeping a close tab on it, Iuri. And I just wanted to thank you for joining us today to discuss GenAI, the growing interest there. And clearly the financial interest is keen. And we know you'll be keeping a watchful eye for us for the balance of the year. Thanks for joining us, Iuri.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mike. It was great.
This is Mike Reynolds. I also want to thank all of you for listening. We'll catch up soon on the next installment of Media Talk.